So, Sean, thank you so much again for giving us your time, your expertise, just, being here with us. I know you've been around for a really long time in the space. You know what you're talking about, and SharePoint is near and dear to my heart, as you know, like it's the backbone of everything. And so it's always exciting when we get to have a SharePoint topic because there's a lot of people that are always like, more SharePoint, more SharePoint. So whenever I get somebody who's got a great SharePoint topic, I'm excited to have them here. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm gonna take off, and the show's all yours.
Okay. Thanks, Sharon. It's good to be here with you guys. I've enjoyed presenting in the past. So this is Solid Foundations, building solutions in an earthquake-prone SharePoint area. And believe it or not, I kind of struggled with that title for a while. There were some preceding options, and I'll just kind of go through those, assuming I can get my clicker to work. There we go. So this session could have been called number 3 runner-up. Questionable foundations. Building solid SharePoint solutions is anything but a science. And that's especially true in the old days. It's getting a little more systematic these days now that we've got SharePoint Online primarily. But, there were times when you could build a solution on top of SharePoint and it wouldn't necessarily do what you wanted it to do. So number 2, SharePoint solution creation, thought of by many as a plague of biblical proportions, especially in the old server-side days. And then finally, number 1 rejected, lasting SharePoint solutions. The Earth is more likely to suffer a meteor strike. So those were the 3 runner-ups. Let me give you a little bit of information about me. I started my career as a polymer chemist, believe it or not. I worked for Procter & Gamble here in Cincinnati, Ohio. P&G is a large enough company that it's possible for someone to transfer into a completely different area. And that's what I did. I transferred internally to information systems. And after that, working for P&G for about 6.5 years, I went out into consulting, and that's where I've been for most of the time. I've been developing software professionally since the mid-90s. Many of you who started developing in that era probably remember COM and DCOM, COM Plus, all the DDE, Dynamic Data Exchange. There's a blast from the past. I've been focusing primarily on SharePoint since 2004. And much of what I do nowadays is SharePoint-centric without necessarily being SharePoint itself. And I'll explain that a little more in a minute. I was awarded the MVP by Microsoft in 2016, sorry. Just trying to get my timer going here. Okay. Make sure I don't blather too much at the end. That was originally, and it was a SharePoint development and SharePoint server MVP. And like everything with Microsoft, names change all the time. As soon as it starts to make some sort of sense, they do a complete about face. So nowadays I work for a company called Acumatica based in Nashua, New Hampshire. They make an intranet framework, digital workplace solution, and it's used pretty heavily by many large organizations. If you went out to the site, you would see. Most of the time, I'm doing operational performance-based troubleshooting and remediation. I do custom development, and I do that both independently and with Acumatica. Microsoft and 365 and Acumatica-based intranet creation and support. So I work directly with Acumatica's platform. And most of the time when I'm not working with Acumatica, I'm doing services for educational nonprofit technical organizations. So that's not working right. There we go. So one thing I wanted to spend just 2 seconds on is something called the TEALS program by Microsoft. Microsoft Philanthropies has the TEALS program, and TEALS stands for Technical Education and Literacy in Schools. I'm going to be going into my 5th year co-teaching with a school up in Cleveland called Shaw High School. And I've been working with the same teacher for 5 years now. We've got a great relationship, and we've done everything from block-based programming to studying for the CompTIA information security exam, or the Security Plus, I think it is. So we've covered a lot of things. And every semester or two, I get a student who will, really stand out, and I build a relationship with those people, and I still maintain many of those contacts. So if you are someone who wants to give back or pay it forward, Teals is one way to do it, to leverage your personal skills with another school who's in need of that kind of guidance and expertise. It's extremely rewarding for me. I get a lot out of the program. I'd say I get as much out of it as I put into it. But go to Teals, Microsoft Teals. There's a link at the end of the presentation. I also want to mention that these slides are already online. So if you go to SharePointInterface.com, which is my blog, you'll find them there. And I will also put that up here on the screen towards the end. So the goal of today's presentation, and for those of you who maybe have not had the chance to experience it, that is a Frisbee golf course goal, or hole, if you will. We had a Frisbee golf course on the campus of my alma mater up at Miami University, and we did quite a bit of that. But SharePoint's plethora of app options over the years, I want to talk about those a little bit, just kind of understand how we got where we are right now. I want to talk about strategic decision points and questions you're probably going to want to ask when designing or trying to determine if SharePoint is a good idea or not. I want to cover all of the currently viable solution options you have available to you, and the landscape has been changing. It's growing dramatically. So things like this presentation are kind of hard to keep up to date. Avoiding painting yourself into a corner with a solution approach, knowing what's deprecated or dead. But first, a little bit about that last point I was mentioning. And yes, if you're thinking born on dates like the Budweiser one, you're correct. So this is Microsoft 365 and SharePoint Online. You might be wondering why I've got a tree there. Well, kind of cheeky way, Microsoft refers to these services as evergreen services, like all of their cloud options. The designation, of course, carries some implications. Anybody who's working with anything in the Microsoft ecosystem right now knows that, things change very quickly. We've got multiple people in the community who have authored books recently. One guy, Paul Stork, authored a Power Automate book, and the day it was released, Microsoft changed the entire interface for the Power Automate tool. And he basically had to go back and redo all the screenshots for the next edition. So, and that's pretty straightforward. Images are going to, not be representative and hold over time. So much of the information I'm going to share today has a born on date, and it will expire in time. So my only request is that you not look me up in 5 years and send me fan mail because I presented something that's no longer accurate due to a SharePoint Online service change. You may laugh, but it will happen. And in fact, it has happened. I had somebody comment on a blog post that I had written 5 years previously about the SharePoint hosted apps and being able to set images for use within SharePoint. They wrote me to inform me that I had it wrong, that there was a property there. And if I just use that, it'd be a much easier way. So, of course, I responded, this didn't exist 5 years ago. So you have to pay attention to the dates on pretty much everything these days, because if something's, a week old, it's probably still true. A month old, I'd start to question. In 6 months, 6 months is an eternity uh, in technology time. So that's something to be aware of. So let's talk about our options over the years. What brought us to this point? So there's a solutions technology timeline that I can summarize pretty easily. So back in the days of SharePoint Portal Server 2003, Windows SharePoint Services version 2, and earlier, um, if you were a power user trying to build a solution, you pretty much had one option and one option only, which isn't really an option. Front Page 2003. That was the tool that would allow you to make kind of powerful changes in a SharePoint site. It also allowed you to completely screw up your site, as many people had done. Developers had one option at that time: compiled code that ran on the server. And there was zero developer assistance or support for development on SharePoint Portal Server 2003. Aside from Orca, for anybody who's ever used that MSI builder, and MSIs themselves. So you would package a solution, you compile the code, you build these MSI packages, and you deploy to the SharePoint server much as you'd install any other tool or add-on. So it was not a great story. Things really started to shift once we got to MOS 2007. They couldn't say SharePoint Portal Server 2007. It was MOS 2007. So that and WSS v3. If you were a power user, you had SharePoint Designer 2007 available to you. We lovingly called it SharePoint Destroyer because, like Front Page 2003, you could brick a SharePoint environment very quickly with too much enhancement done by SharePoint Designer. Of course, we had workflow-based options, and I'll be talking more about that. InfoPath. InfoPath is, as Andrew Connell said, InfoPath is 2 4-letter words. So there's a video that I linked to at the end of this presentation where Mark Rackley put it together and basically said, just stop using InfoPath. It was a fun little experiment. So developers, if you were a developer, you had full trust features and solutions. And this is where we started to see some genuine SharePoint integration, or at least support for design patterns. These were still full trust solutions, still full trust features. They had to be deployed to the server, but 2007 was the version that Microsoft introduced the feature framework for SharePoint, and that's capital F feature. We did have SOAP-based web services like SP services, and for those of you who don't recognize the picture there, that's Mark Anderson. Mark Anderson is the author of SharePoint Services, and SharePoint Services is what made SharePoint 2007 accessible to most users and or lesser skilled developers, because it wrapped all of SharePoint's old VTI web services, and that's for Vermeer Technology and Industries, VTI. And so anytime you put in a path on SharePoint, at least back in 2007, oftentimes you had an underscore VTI. Now you know what it means. Now we get to SharePoint Server 2010 and SharePoint Framework, because WSS would have made too much sense. But if you're a power user, you still had SharePoint Designer 2010, which, yes, you could continue to wreck things. You had workflow-based options, and of course, InfoPath. Now, developers, you actually got Visual Studio support for feature solution creation. There was Jonathan. Yeah, it goes way back into the annals of SharePoint history. But we got the solution creation templates for SharePoint in 2010. Of course, we still had our SOAP-based web services. SP services continued to work. We also got some WCF-based web services, so we started moving into the future. PowerShell, we got our first set of admin commandlets in PowerShell in 2010. You could still use it prior to 2010, but you had to use .NET types because there were no specific SharePoint types within PowerShell. Now, one of the things that has been a focus over probably more than a decade is the fact that SharePoint always seemed to be lagging behind. And I mean that in terms of solution creation, end user availability. There were, people were building on the modern web stack, and we were still trying to figure out the proper way to put a table on a SharePoint page. Um, it was it was a dark time. I'll say that. And so, oh yeah, I guess I should advance the slide. So this is what you got with 2010. Now, at this point, after 2010, things shook. The earth shook. And, a lot of what we had been doing happened to get undone. So this is a solutions timeline after 2013. So if you were a power user, you didn't have SharePoint Designer anymore. You didn't have InfoPath. You had these things available to you, but there are red X's through them for a reason, which I'll cover in a little bit. Now, for those of you using SharePoint Online, you are probably well aware of the Power Platform, as well as, if it's not the Power Platform, you're trying to do stuff as a citizen developer or power user, you know, uh, Microsoft has made it pretty clear they want to focus on the Power Platform, and that's a great area to focus on, especially if you don't have the technical know-how to put together something more code based. So for developers, all sorts of things. We still had full trust solutions. Not everybody was in the cloud at this point, remember, but Microsoft, I was it at Microsoft, um, sitting in an audience of probably 200 other ISVs, independent software vendors. This is back when I worked with Idera. The cloud app model was introduced to us in 2013, and you could hear a pin drop in that room of 200 people when Microsoft said you will no longer be running code on SharePoint servers. Because I worked for a company whose entire portfolio was based on admin access to SharePoint, being able to access things like backup, performance counters, things like that. And the SharePoint cloud app model, primarily provider hosted apps and add-ins, they didn't run on SharePoint. They ran somewhere else and used SharePoint as a set of web services. So you guess I should have the chat open here. Um, so, that's the cloud app model, which we will talk more about because it plays a big role nowadays. We still had SOAP-based web services, which were always kind of cryptic. We had WCF-based web services, Windows Communication Foundation. RESTful web services were being introduced. SharePoint 2013 didn't have a REST, or prior to 2013, SharePoint didn't have much of a REST interface. There was a little you could do with a few of the services, but not what you can do nowadays. We got the client-side object model hashed out in multiple platforms. SharePoint Framework, PowerShell, and nowadays SharePoint Premium Embedded, which you may have heard about. SharePoint Premium is more or less Syntex rebranded. And SharePoint Embedded runs SharePoint as more a set of services, basically containers without the front end of SharePoint. So you still have access to SharePoint's version history, files, virtual file system, all that stuff. You just don't have an interface. And so it becomes something nice to use for building back ends. Let's see here. And let me click back on this. There we go. So if you're trying to figure out how to build your solution, you've got many different options, a few of which are just different than the last time I think I may have given this presentation. And so while I was, reviewing it for today, I updated quite a bit of stuff. And so with that, we'll continue forward. So that's a brief history of SharePoint development. And you could see that it's gotten better and better and better. So what are some things we should be asking ourselves as we're considering SharePoint as a solution platform? Because that's, Microsoft originally positioned SharePoint as a solution platform to build on. And of course, they've slowly taken that away because we no longer have access to server-side functionality. And we have to treat SharePoint as a set of web services for all intents and purposes. So we're building our own clients. What are some questions and decision points we want to consider? So the first of these is, are you going to build your solution on premises, in the cloud, or both? And this is probably the single biggest factor that will drive additional decisions in design. Because some of those options, there are only available in the cloud. Some are only available on-prem. And being in the cloud doesn't necessarily mean SharePoint Online, but it does in the majority of cases. There are other hosting providers who either have their own environments or somehow repackage Microsoft's. But remember, the cloud doesn't necessarily mean SharePoint Online. And today's, Microsoft, back a number of years ago, when Satya Nadella stepped into the CEO role, he took Microsoft to a mobile first, cloud first standpoint, which means Microsoft builds its tools and its platforms and workloads primarily for mobile first and cloud first. So these things are going out to the cloud. We used to get things in service packs and hot fixes and things like that. Now the table has kind of changed and been inverted. Things get rolled out to the cloud and then eventually backported into an on-premises install, because there are still people running SharePoint on premises. But I, continue, and I'm sure, Sharon and Jonathan would agree, there are no shortage of people still looking for services to move to the cloud. So bear in mind that, we're still seeing a lot of adoption of the cloud. We're just, we haven't seen it slow down much, honestly. So the other question that sometimes factors in, will you remain on that SharePoint platform for the anticipated life of the solution? And so what do I mean by that? I mean, if you think about your solution, many solutions outlive their intended period of usefulness. So what is the expected and realistic life expectancy of your solution? How long does it need to be around? And will your solution need to migrate or transform? For instance, if your company is going to the cloud and you build for on-prem, you need to consider that when you're building your solution. Will there be a platform upgrade, for instance, a SharePoint upgrade during the lifetime of the solution? Well, if we're doing it in SharePoint Online, the answer is there's always upgrades happening. I mean, Microsoft has a bi-weekly cadence of rolling things out, and it takes a while to get to some tenants, but SharePoint is very much a platform in flux. And as anybody who has ever worked with SharePoint solutions in the past, we're always told, oh, it's upgrade ready, upgrade ready. I have never worked with a SharePoint solution that survived an upgrade without some form of transformation. It just doesn't exist. And if anyone has one, please let me know. I'd like to think that Microsoft wasn't lying to me the whole time. So another consideration is, where And what are the non-SharePoint interfaces for systems that will be part of the solution architecture? SharePoint doesn't live in a vacuum. It can exist that way if you're just using, basic collaboration services, but most folks choose to implement and end up using other pieces of other systems for integration. For instance, Workday. Anybody who's got Workday or Salesforce or ServiceNow, these are all, third-party systems, and you may want to consume some of that data in whatever SharePoint solution you're building. Now, this doesn't mean that all your data resides, all your solution processes reside in SharePoint. You may have third-party integrators, and we'll talk a little bit about connectors when we get to the Power Platform. Some systems can't be reached from the cloud or on premises. Excuse me. So, web services, legacy systems, and others, you need to understand where the services are that you need to integrate with and recognize that SharePoint does have hybrid connectors for several of its services to bridge the on-prem and cloud gap for some things like Power Automate, for Search Federation. There are a number of hybrid connectors, and those may play into your solution and what you're trying to do. So some technical considerations, and boy, I missed my Windows phone. I had this very same Nokia. It was a good phone. So what sort of user interface or user experience is needed? And what do I mean by that? This is more than just, the wireframes. This is, are there specific capabilities that must be present in the user interface? If you don't know what WCAG is, you probably want to learn about it, especially since it's playing a big role these days. WCAG is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's also known in the government Section 508 compliance, and they rate the friendliness or capability of a system along an A, AA, AAA sort of a scale. And if you're working for the government and you're building things that the general public is going to consume, you're probably building with WCAG in mind and AA standard as a target. SharePoint is much better than it used to be in terms of compliance, but it is not fully WCAG compliant, at least at the AA and AAA level. I'm not sure about the single letter A level. So another question is, does your application need to do any heavy or CPU intensive work? Because this will naturally direct you on where you may want to build that solution. For instance, you may want to, if it's something that's a lot of work and it's CPU intensive, you may want to build it over in Azure and consume the results in SharePoint, kind of like Power BI and Dataverse. What is your ability to envision your solution as a web application? You know, are you okay with building web applications and the constraints, which are much less these days, that might be imposed upon you? Are your UX and UI requirements clear? People, you may know you need a new order processing system, but do you have an idea of how you want that to look and function? And does your solution even require a user interface? Um, you know, we a great a great example is many of the provider hosted add-ins. Since they run on another server and consume SharePoint as a set of interfaces and web services, they oftentimes don't have a user interface. The system does what it's designed to do kind of in the background, much like you would write a classical full trust SharePoint timer job. Anybody who's ever written timer job code knows that the only interface you've got is what you've got through the timer job interface. So, does your solution even require a user interface is a excellent question to ask. Another one is, does your application need to be able to act as someone other than the current user? Because this carries a number of implications. If your solution needs to impersonate someone or act as someone other than the current user, you're not going to see this in a browser-based application, because SharePoint used to have a switch user, which disappeared around 2010, I think. But nowadays, you log in, you get your OAuth token, and that's what authenticates you back to SharePoint. Most browser-based applications and those that run client-side cannot impersonate another user. So understand your application use cases before you decide. This is an area where provider-hosted add-ins come in handy, because that unique framework has associated with the application an application identity, so that if you need it to carry out privileged operations in your SharePoint environment, you can do so through that application identity without granting specific users access to more than they should have. But just understand, your use cases before you make this decision. So does your solution need to store or persist data in some way? I mean, that's most of what we do with SharePoint. We are persisting data either in list form, in document form. There are SharePoint for collaboration is, there's definitely a need to store persist data. Most applications have this requirement in some form. And what is the nature of the data to be persisted? Complex objects or scalar values. How easily can they be represented in sort of a flat structure? Can the data be stored or structured for storage in SharePoint? This is an excellent question, and it's a point I'm going to get to in a little bit, probably on the next slide. Do you have a need for elevated or even extreme data security? Many of the GCC high tenants, the government tenants that are, require very specific access, there are certain things you can store in there, and there are certain things you can't. So knowing where your data is going, and of course, nowadays we all have GDPR regulations and whatnot, especially anyone who's dealing with European governments and other governments. Our government is trying to do the same thing. I think we do it to varying degrees. Let me see this comment. SharePoint Online using 3.5 floppy disks. Yeah. How's that working out for you, Jonathan? So this is one point I want to make, and I want to make it very clear. Does your application have a need to work with relational data? You probably see a lot of things in caps and highlighted. SharePoint is not a relational database management system, and it has never been one. So, SharePoint has lookup columns that allow you to look up from one list to another to pull in related values. However, any solution or any need that for data that requires referential integrity, triggers, constraints, etc., you're not going to get that with SharePoint. This is where we start talking about SQL Server, Dataverse, other options for storage. I worked with an organization based out of Florida for a number of years. And we had one client who used SharePoint like a big hammer. Everything was a nail. And they would try and do everything with SharePoint because they had paid for SharePoint. They asked us to estimate the creation of a particular solution they wanted. And we recommended not to use SharePoint. They had a relational database requirement, and they thought they could make SharePoint lists do the same thing. We didn't get that. We didn't get that contract. My understanding is they were underwhelmed by what SharePoint had been doing for them or was capable of doing in their solutions context. So don't confuse SharePoint with a relational database management system. Doesn't mean that SharePoint data is unorganized, but you won't achieve third normal form with it. And if you need a reference to normal forms, I've got one in the links. SharePoint has lightweight lookup columns. So I think I've, beat this one to death enough. Don't mistake those lookup columns for RDMS relational capabilities. So I've been over some of the common observations that I've seen and faced over the years. And the only thing I think we can probably agree on, change is the only constant. Everything is shifting under our feet all the time. By the time you're ready to design your solution, there are likely to be additional questions and criteria. And so, if any of you feel like I haven't covered any of the design considerations, or at least higher strategy guidance, feel free to let me know. I have no problems modifying this presentation. And in fact, I would want to make it more complete. So what are our solution design options? Once we've talked about questions we want to ask and things to consider. There is no single magic answer. As with SharePoint, everything SharePoint, it depends. Each of the items and concerns we've discussed thus far factor into the ultimate approach taken. Hard blockers and absolute not circumstances tend to be rare. And, the thoughts and suggestions I'm about to cover in the next several slides should not be thought of in absolute terms. It's always possible to find situations which contraindicate an approach. It's important to know that. And, the first potentially controversial thing I'm going to talk about is full trust solutions. Now, with few exceptions, the days of full trust solutions are behind us. The only way you're going to be able to run full trust solutions is if you control the SharePoint servers, because Microsoft will not allow you to install them in the cloud. Your solution would impact all of the tenants in that environment. So, full trust solutions will be the province of on-prem installations only, or specially hosted SharePoint solutions that may be offered by someone else. Full trust solutions are not required to impersonate users or execute in the context of an application-only identity. And this is what I was mentioning a bit earlier with provider-hosted add-ins, is that they can assume an identity that is their own and act with elevated privileges beyond what your users have. So maybe you wanted to, and that also falls into, that's where, people who were writing timer jobs on-prem as full trust solutions. There is a Microsoft employee, Richard Zizrega, who authored an article, and I think I've got it in the links, as a it's kind of like this is how I did it in SharePoint Full Trust. This is how you do it in the new cloud app model. So it was authored sometime around 2014, 2015, and I think it's still relevant. And I will have to check to see if I have that link. So Full Trust Solutions originally developed a bad name due to developers writing code that had unintentional effects on SharePoint farms. This is why admins and developers in the SharePoint environment tended to be at each other's throats. Mostly the admins going after the developers, because a solution built on and in SharePoint, there were tremendous number of bad things and bad behaviors that developers would introduce into the code, and then when the farm was performing, who gets the calls for that? Well, the admins do. And the admins don't have visibility into these solutions. So it created some animosity. That's why we got the app model that we've got now, which basically makes it blatantly obvious. If the problem's in SharePoint, it's in SharePoint. If the problem's with customization, it's over in the provider hosted add-in. Are there cases when I might not want to rule out full trust solutions? And this is blasphemy to some. There are cases when you might want to look at a full trust solution. First and foremost, you're on-prem or have access to the SharePoint server. If you know you're not going to be going to the cloud in the application's lifetime, if you're adapting an existing full trust solution for on-premises use, and this is, you're trying to upgrade or rebuild your solution for SharePoint. It started as a full trust solution. You're trying to get it working maybe on a new version of the platform. If the development team is struggling with the tech curve, and the reason I say don't laugh is because in 2013, if you had told me that I was going to be writing JavaScript as the primary, using JavaScript as the primary tool to build SharePoint solutions in 5 years, I'd have said, no way in hell. It's not going to happen. I'm one of those guys who bet the farm on Silverlight. For those of you who aren't familiar with Silverlight, it was Microsoft's attempt to more or less merge C# into a web, merge it with a web object model so that compiled code developers such as me could use a solution and could use their skills to build a solution that didn't require JavaScript. Lots of developers, especially old-time SharePoint developers, aren't comfortable with JavaScript. And there was a session I gave it was called, I don't even remember what it was called, but basically it was directed at older SharePoint developers and what they were going to need to learn to remain SharePoint developers in the 2013 and beyond versions. And it was pretty well attended most of the times I gave it. And if you are truly building something that can only be built with full trust code, and like I said, there are many provider hosted add-in capabilities that can do what provider trusted or full trust code did, but some things cannot. And so, knowing what you're trying to do, and if you feel like, if you can check these boxes and this criteria, it's, and you are getting flack from whoever might be architecting or directing you, full trust solutions are still well and alive. Microsoft certainly doesn't shine a light on them, but each version of SharePoint continues to support that full trust model of interacting with SharePoint. So if the shoe fits, what are our full trust alternatives? Well, of course, Microsoft, and the point of this is, doesn't push us out of a plane without a functioning parachute. Typically, when Microsoft deprecates a technology, they give us lots of warning. The dates are set far into the future, but organizations still run right up to them and over sometimes. So, naturally, there are alternatives to full trust solutions. And it's no big surprise that provider hosted add-ins, like I said, in conventional full trust scenarios, are a nice alternative. And these are all the different things I was talking about throughout this session. PHAs can impersonate, they can run on a separate app server. Be built in any language is something that some people don't realize, that when you're using SharePoint as a web service, you can build on Java, you can build in a LAMP stack, and it doesn't matter what language you're using as long as you form your web packets or form your service calls to SharePoint in the appropriate manner. So you're not restricted to just Microsoft technologies. The client-side push. So Microsoft makes no secret of it. Development and customization is best done somewhere other than or in the SharePoint farm. Since 2013, the expansion of dev capabilities has pushed further into browser and client-side territory. So this is exciting and maybe a little scary to some. This was largely true in the past. I know nowadays some folks are coming to SharePoint without knowing its history or how we got to where we are right now. These are, typically younger folks building on a full web stack using open source tools. And that's, the approach the SharePoint framework has taken and the way Microsoft has pushed to make us as developers more skilled and more competent with client-side development. And so, even though it might be unfamiliar to older SharePoint developers, the rest of this session, we're going to be talking about client-side options and that part in the equation. Yeah, what I just said. Okay, so client-side options for development. These all typically focus on JavaScript. Um, we, we've had JavaScript available for quite some time, but it's only within recent years that we saw proliferation of complex web stacks like React um, and Angular.js. Both seek to do roughly the same thing, but Microsoft has decided on React. And so if you're doing SharePoint framework development, you're probably using React in some form. Of course, we got the client-side object model available to us, as well as the newer REST-based web services. And, Microsoft is trying to nudge folks away from CSOM towards REST. It's probably, if I had to guess, it's easier to monetize, but that's a guess. So going to JavaScript-based solutions allowed Microsoft to modify or modernize antiquated SharePoint development approaches. So the modern dev stack is more common. I'm talking about Node.js, NPM, NVM, Yeoman. Each of these is a JavaScript library that plays a part in the modern SharePoint development stack. So we no longer need special tools or Visual Studio templates for building client-side options. We do it much the way anybody would build a standard web solution, which is, though painful for some of us older folks, it is a good way to go into the future. Now, Microsoft and SharePoint in particular are on par with other web platforms in terms of tooling. So, you should be able to leverage skills across platforms to work reasonably well in another one. So, do you hate JavaScript? It's not your only option, Yeah, and like I said, you know, older SharePoint developers tend to fare better with C# and ASP.NET. And they do things like use Silverlight, like I did, which is now officially dead as far as Microsoft's concerned. In addition to JavaScript, CSOM libraries exist for .NET. So maybe you just want to build a .NET application that's the interface for something you're doing in SharePoint. You can interact with SharePoint Online or SharePoint servers of your own through CSOM and through the REST services. They're callable with a browser. You just form your REST request. Wow, that's hard to say too quickly. So web services are, naturally platform agnostic. And so any language that has a REST-based tool or augmentation to it that allows it to more easily form REST requests, it can use SharePoint. For those of you those developers out there who know, we have Postman. Postman is one of the tools I use, and it's used to essentially build REST requests and provide parameters. It's kind of like for lack of a better way to put it, a test harness. It'll execute your REST request and display the data you get back. So it becomes very easy to prototype an application or the approach an application is going to use with a tool like Postman. So JavaScript snippets, jQuery, and simpler JavaScript approaches. There are some of these. You may not be completely comfortable with JavaScript, but you're okay with using a little jQuery to pull a particular element or attribute out of the DOM document object model. And so these approaches still work today. They're still not very ALM friendly, application lifecycle management. There's still a lot of manually either entering snippets into SharePoint or trying to integrate them with a robust code management system like Azure DevOps. You can only store files in Azure DevOps for those who are familiar with it, but formal ALM tooling and accessibility is not quite there for this stuff yet. Now, if you're unfamiliar with modern web stacks or tooling, use what works for you. If you're unfamiliar, of course. If you're comfortable, try SharePoint framework, sink your teeth into it. Andrew Connell over at, what's his company's name? I'm going to kick myself later for this, but he does an end-to-end training for SharePoint framework, which starts from literally crawling and takes you up to the point where you're building SharePoint framework solutions comfortably. So SharePoint framework allows you to use React, other JavaScript frameworks, and TypeScript. For those of you who don't know what TypeScript is, basically TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. It introduces things like classes and some object orientation into TypeScript. Into JavaScript. So now I take particular exception to someone who learns TypeScript without knowing JavaScript. The reason is because TypeScript has to be compiled or transpiled to JavaScript. It can't go the other way. JavaScript cannot be retrofitted to TypeScript. So if you don't know how to deal with JavaScript or debug it, you might have problems in the future trying to understand what's being emitted by the TypeScript transpiler. Building admin tools or scripting components. Don't forget PowerShell. PowerShell, I once met an admin who said, if I have to do anything more than once, I'm going to script it, which I thought was a great way of looking at things. And many admins are more comfortable with PowerShell than they are with SharePoint or development techniques. So, you can functionally write PowerShell. In fact, I could probably tell you whether or not somebody's a developer by how they write PowerShell. Admins typically make heavy use of the commandlets that Microsoft provides, whereas a developer will commonly fall back to .NET framework in order to carry out certain functions. It's a different style, but both are equally powerful and capable of doing the same things, more or less. So what about our power users, or citizen developers as they are called these days? Microsoft has made it a focus to remove or minimize the amount of technical knowledge to solve business problems, or that you need to solve business problems. If you can describe the way a business process is intended to work, the tools make it much more accessible to those folks who, maybe they don't have a CS degree or they don't know C#, but they know their business process. And we've seen a lot of these citizen developer options evolve over the years. And we've got a really powerful tool set right now in the Power Platform. So when I first started giving this talk, this was the Power Platform. You'd use Power BI for data visualization and data dashboards. Power Apps to rapidly create user interfaces that can be paired with business logic and connectors. Similar to Power Automate, but Power Automate excels at orchestrating long-running business processes non-interactively, and it is the named successor for SharePoint workflow of any form. We also had Power Virtual Agents that would allow you to create bots with minimal technical knowledge. You'd put your script in or your prompts, and it would do much of the heavy lifting for you. So nowadays, this is what the Power Platform looks like. So all the tools of the previous Power Platform, plus Power Pages, AI Builder, Dataverse, Power Effects. I don't even know what Power Effects is, but it's now available to us. And of course, the current favorite flavor. Why do I do this to myself? Current favorite flavor is, of course, Copilot in its various forms. We oftentimes in the community, we joke that Copilot is a drinking game because every time there's a presentation involving Microsoft, it's Copilot, Copilot, Copilot. You've got Copilot in SharePoint, Copilot in Teams, Copilot Studio. Copilot is everywhere nowadays. So you at least owe it to yourself to familiarize yourself with what it can do, even if you don't dive into it wholeheartedly. And since it's integrated into many of these tools now, it can leverage the power of generative AI to write snippets of code for you or put, a Power Automate flow together. It's really powerful. And we're seeing, these things build on top of one another. We still have all the underlying plumbing that we got to deal with, but the business users at the top who are less technical and more business oriented can start to leverage some of the power that's down here but at this current level, so they can do things they weren't able to previously. So Power Automate is of particular interest to us when building SharePoint-centric solutions. As mentioned, SharePoint 2010, you can't build a workflow. SharePoint 2013 workflows are due for the chopping block on April 2nd, 2026. And I guarantee you, April 1st is when April 1st, 2026 is going to be far from an April Fool's Day for a lot of organizations because they won't heed the warning. And so when 2013 workflows are killed off and their processes stop working, sometimes that's what it takes for an organization to sit up and take notice. Power Automate is the named successor for workflow needs, as I mentioned earlier. And Power Automate permits the creation of the same style of business solution as SharePoint workflow. In fact, I would say that it allows you to do far more than SharePoint designer authored workflows ever did. And if you haven't investigated Power Automate yet, spend a little time, just look at the already prepared templates that Microsoft makes available for everything from sending an email, when something is deleted from SharePoint. I know you can do some of the stuff with alerts, but there is so much more that can be done with Power Automate. And so no two business solutions are the same or have the same requirements or goals. So it's hard to be completely prescriptive here. There are countless approaches and technologies from which you can choose to build a SharePoint solution or SharePoint-based solutions. This diagram is actually old. The number of options right now is much greater than what we've got here. Microsoft is constantly rolling out new web technologies, platforms, web services, and tools to build solutions. Hopefully, the difference between the Power Platform with the original 4 or 5 technologies that I introduced probably about 5 years ago. I included that, and that's why I included the current shot of the Power Platform, so you had an idea. There's stuff changing every day. Many of us lament, it used to be possible to know the entire Microsoft stack. Now you're lucky if you know what you focus on in the Microsoft stack. Okay, so avoiding the corner, and I know I'm running out of time here, so uh, you want to avoid situations with honest and realistic planning. How long will your solution stay in operation? You going to migrate to the cloud or shift to using on-prem? Uh, how can solution dependencies be minimized? That's a big one. Dependencies will kill you, particularly when you're talking about integrating with third-party systems. Can decisions be made to reduce potential maintenance and ongoing changes over time? We have to design with a degree of flexibility nowadays because SharePoint Online as a service is changing all the time. Can lower tech approaches work? And I would count the Power Platform options as lower tech approaches. I know their underlying implementation is fairly complex to make those tools that approachable, but you know, it exposes functionality that business users can use. And can we avoid reinventing the wheel with third-party apps and tools? In SharePoint, that is one of the key areas where um, I would say organizations blow a lot of money. They'll build solutions that somebody else offers for a licensing fee. So you know, it's never cheaper to reinvent the wheel. All things being equal, if you have the ability to decide, choose a client-side strategy over server-side strategy. Opt for open web standards and web services, for example, REST-based web services. Microsoft is pushing the JavaScript development stack. So SharePoint framework and associated technologies like React will probably have a longer life. Every time Microsoft releases a developer technology, they say, this is the last one we're going to roll out. They've not stuck to it to this point. So I'm sure something will supplant it at one point. But so just follow Microsoft's development guidance and suggestions when you're putting something together. So here are some technologies that you, as a rule, shouldn't use or build into your solutions, even though they may appear okay. These are all things we talked about. So I'm going to just let that sink in. And when in doubt, check support. If you Google any one of these, you'll get, end of life dates or when it's due to be deprecated. So just check with Microsoft. So in summary, there is no one size fits all approach to solution development. Technology choice is one scenario, or a technology choice in one scenario may be contraindicated in another. It really depends on your circumstances. And a little extra effort seeking help and guidance from someone who has been building SharePoint solutions for a long time is worth the time and investment. And I'm sure Sharon would agree with me on that one. So that's the end of the formal presentation. Any questions?
So if anybody has any questions, feel free to come off mute, post your questions in the chat. Oh my God, Sean, like that was amazing. Couldn't have said it better myself. So thank you so much for going through all of that and explaining all of that. I know I've already gotten tons of comments, people, oh, this is great. I did put the link in there for the Sharing is Caring, back to what Dave Warner and Hugo Bernier do, because they do a lot of great work in helping people to kind of understand some of this stuff at the dev level. There's all Sean's info. If you want to connect, feel free to throw it in chat or grab a link off of here. If you have any other questions, come off mute, raise your hand, post it in chat. I apologize that I have to run because I have another commitment, but I'll leave this open and you guys are welcome to stick around and chat as long as you want. And thanks so much again for being here.
Yeah. Thank you all. Okay, well, I would say, feel free to reach out. Resources and links. Yeah. So these are the resources and links. And you can get the presentation I just gave by going out to my blog address, which is sharepointinterface.com. There's a presentations and materials link over on the right side of the screen, a little bit down. So you'll be able to find them there. And feel free to reach out to me, if you've got questions or just want to bounce an idea off of someone. You can get me at Sean@SharePointInterface.com or Sean@BitstreamFoundry.com. So it doesn't look like we have much flowing in. I answered the question about the resources and links. Well, thank you guys. I really enjoyed presenting to you today, and I hope you found the information useful. And reach out to me if you have any questions.